In one of my previous videos, where I analyzed the possibility of new Russian aggression in the Caucasus region, I touched on the topic of the so-called Zangezur corridor, which has strategic importance for Azerbaijan and Turkey in the event of a real war. Naturally, many viewers had a perfectly logical question. Are there any other similar corridors on the world map, especially in the post-Soviet space, control over which would provide a significant military and political advantage? Naturally, in the event of a hypothetical conflict, although considering the pace at which Moscow is spreading fear and uncertainty, such a conflict is not hypothetical at all, but actually quite possible. The most likely place for a military clash between Russia and Western countries is the Suwalki corridor, which today allows the entire eastern flank of NATO to maintain its combat capability. And, in fact, that's why it's a major thorn in the side of the homegrown Kremlin Führer. Today we will examine the strategic significance of this corridor in the context of a possible Russian attack on the countries of Eastern Europe. We will analyze the publicly available plans of the adversaries and try to figure out how real the danger of a Third World War breaking out because of the Suwalki corridor is. As always, all our forecasts will be based solely on facts and the analysis of existing geopolitical trends. My name is Semyon, this is the Mega Shoot television channel, and we, in recent years, recent. A bit of geography, purely geographically. The Suwalki corridor is a part of Poland's territory that connects with Lithuania, kind of a junction between these two European countries. It's a crucial transport route that ensures stable communication between Lithuania and Poland. And on a larger scale, the Suwalki corridor is the only logistical route that provides a land connection between Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia and the rest of the European Union and NATO members. The strategic importance of this corridor is due to the fact that on both sides of it are countries that, to put it mildly, are not very friendly toward the West. To the east is Russia's loyal satellite, Belarus, which has almost completely lost all remnants of statehood and independence. From the west, and even worse, the Kaliningrad region of Russia. For those who have forgotten or are not aware, the Kaliningrad region is that piece of land which used to be called East Prussia. But in 1945 this territory was annexed by Stalin, and the ancient fortress of the Teutonic Knights, Königsberg, became the Soviet city of Kaliningrad. After the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics collapsed, this land stayed with Russia, letting Moscow keep military and political control in the Baltic region. It should also be noted that the Suwalki corridor is an extremely narrow strip of land. It's like a bottleneck. After all, the minimum distance between Belarus and the Kaliningrad region is about 6 meters, and the widest part is about 100 meters. This situation naturally puts the security of the communication routes between Poland and Lithuania at risk. The situation worsens because the Suwalki corridor is among Poland's least populated and most economically underdeveloped regions. Only Suwalki stands out among the larger cities, and even its population is under 70,000. The area is very rugged, mostly forested and swampy. The transportation infrastructure here is underdeveloped, with only 2 highways, of which only one is an expressway. The situation with the railway is much worse. Between Lithuania and Poland, there is only a single-track non-electrified line, Białystok-Suwałki-Kaunas. At the same time, the Lithuanian section of the railway uses the so-called Russian gauge, which is 1,520 mm wide, while on Polish territory, the European gauge of 1,435 mm is used. In Szesztokai, a border town, there's a railway junction where train wheel sets are changed, similar to the process at the Polish-Ukrainian border in Hrubieszów, Rawa-Ruska or Yahodin. Naturally, all this wheel changing greatly delays passenger transport and essential goods delivery. Accordingly, this key logistical route is outdated and very vulnerable. There's also good news. The European Union's major Rail Baltica infrastructure project is currently underway. It involves the construction of a modern high-speed railway line with a standard European gauge, which will directly connect Warsaw through the Suwałki corridor with Kaunas, Riga and Tallinn. This will radically change regional logistics, making transportation faster and more efficient. However, the completion of construction is scheduled only for 2028, so we still need to hold out for at least 3 more years. Well, And one last point, the Suwalki corridor also hosts the energy bridge between the Baltic countries and the rest of Europe, namely the Litpol Link power transmission line, which connects Polish and Lithuanian substations, and the gas interconnection Poland-Lithuania gas pipeline, which gave the Baltic countries access to the European gas market and the liquefied gas terminal in the Polish port of Świnoujście. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia rely entirely on energy imports from the rest of Europe due to their natural resources. The aggressor could easily take advantage of this Achilles heel of NATO. As you know, the Suwalki corridor is the most vulnerable point, not just for NATO and the European Union, but for all of European civilization, both in military and political terms. Any military invasion by Russia, whether unilateral or bilateral, if not repelled in time, will automatically isolate Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia from the main body of NATO. Then we'll see the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics 2.0 return within the 1991 borders. These concerns are by no means unfounded, no matter how much we wish they were. During Iron Wolf 2017 joint exercises involving 9 NATO countries, most generals present acknowledged this land corridor's extreme vulnerability. Given the current balance of forces, resistance to Russian aggression would last just 36 to 60 hours. That's it, a full land blockade of the 3 European states. And considering that there is a large naval base of the Baltic Fleet in the city of Baltisk in the Kaliningrad region, Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia would be blocked from the sea within a matter of hours. That's the sad reality. Of course, the fact that the forested and swampy terrain of the Suwalki corridor objectively favors the defending side is beyond any doubt. Moreover, in these remote areas, many fortifications from World War II have been preserved. The Germans built reinforced concrete pillboxes and bunkers to repel the Red Army's 1945 offensives on Königsberg. If desired, they could be reactivated, put in order, and used as an integral part of the overall defense strategy. On the other hand, such rugged terrain combined with underdeveloped infrastructure significantly complicates mechanized transfers and logistics. Simply put, due to the lack of roads, the NATO troops sent to help simply won't make it in time before the Russian ring closes. Some argue that Finland and Sweden joining NATO has greatly reduced the Suwalki corridor's strategic importance. After all, if necessary, it's possible to quickly transfer additional forces from Finland to Estonia across the waters of the Gulf of Finland. From Helsinki to Tallinn, it's less than 80 kilometers in a straight line, which is about a 2-hour journey for an average destroyer, but in reality it's not that simple. The problem is that the Baltic Fleet already has a strong presence in the Gulf of Finland. The largest Russian naval base, Kronstadt, is not that far away. Therefore, with a high degree of probability, this sea route will be blocked rather quickly by both surface vessels and the available Russian submarines. As for longer sea routes, for example from Sweden to Latvia, there's a complication here as well, and it lies in the control over the strategically important Swedish city of Gotland. It's not uncommon for many Kremlin propagandists, as well as paid experts like Karaganov, to openly call for an amphibious landing and the capture of this piece of land. And their words have a certain rational basis, because if Russia were to gain control over Gotland, it would become the undisputed master of the entire Baltic Sea, and then no one would be able to stop it. In short, the Suwalki corridor is the only route that allows for stable communication between the 3 Baltic countries, which are still tempting targets for Putin and the other states that have real military power. That's why it was, is, and will stay a possible target for an aggressor's attack. Our armor is strong and our tanks are fast. For Russia, maintaining continuous land communications is crucial. Just remember how the Putin administration was determined to secure a land corridor to Crimea at any cost. The bridge built to Kerch was clearly not enough for them. The same goes for the Kaliningrad region. Even though this area is armed to the teeth, it still remains a high-risk zone for the Kremlin. That's why cutting this bitter knot is the best option for them. As for the specific plans of action in Moscow, experts highlight 2 main scenarios as the most likely. The first scenario is isolating the Baltic states by closing the Suwalki corridor and imposing a naval blockade. If successful quickly, Putin could challenge NATO, mainly the United States, with an unsolvable dilemma, risking a large-scale war that could escalate to nuclear conflict. or simply come to terms with the possible loss of Allied territories and the establishment of pro-Russian puppet regimes, with the possibility of further annexation like Crimea. The second option is a classic blitzkrieg, similar to the one Putin wanted to carry out on February 24, 2022. By suppressing air defenses, conducting airborne landings, and making deep breakthroughs with many tanks and armored vehicles. But even in this case, the Suwalki corridor is assigned a crucial role necessary to cut off the main transport lifelines supplying the Baltic countries. And in that case, Russia would also be presented with a fait accompli. And then fulfilling its obligations to its allies would be extremely difficult, if possible at all. Honestly, if Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, or even just their isolation were occupied, activating Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty for Collective Defense would have been extremely difficult. NATO countries would be required to conduct a large-scale offensive operation to break the blockade or to fully liberate these countries, with the prospect of facing a nuclear response from the Kremlin. However, there is another option for Putin's actions, which Western strategists considered a priority 10 years ago, but now it has been put on the back burner as unrealistic. It was based on the idea that Russia would follow the Donbas scenario, destabilizing the country from within. Of course, with the active participation of the Russian and Russian-speaking population. Many seriously feared that a Narva People's Republic could appear in Estonia and a Latgale People's Republic in Latvia. And then, according to the well-known scenario, volunteers will let in the Presnya people, the Cossacks, and of course Putin in the form of troops. In this scenario, the Suwalki corridor would take on a new role, becoming a center for destabilizing the situation in the region, sowing chaos and panic in the northeastern voivodeships of Poland. However, after the events of 2022, it's unlikely that Putin will bother that much. Hybrid warfare has evolved into an era of full-scale open wars. Thus, from the Kremlin's point of view, the Suwalki Gap is the place where NATO's true determination to defend its members can be reliably tested. If Russia, under the pretext of protecting the corridor between Kaliningrad and Belarus, starts aggression, the West's inability to respond effectively to this threat would mean the collapse of the entire alliance as a defensive organization. That's exactly what the former KGB lieutenant colonel has pursued for the past 2 decades. Subtitles by the Belarusian factor. This situation is made worse because NATO's military and political leadership has for a long time underestimated the possibility of an attack from Belarus, considering this scenario unlikely, and therefore preference was given to repelling an attack from Kaliningrad. It was long thought that dictator Lukashenko, though loyal to the Kremlin, would not dare commit direct aggression against one or even 2 sovereign states. In the West, many made the mistaken conclusion that during the events of the Russian Spring in 2014, Vaska took a cautiously wait-and-see position and did not get involved in this hybrid mess. This allowed him not only to save face, but also to position himself on the international stage as a mediator, a sort of effective one. Peacemaker. It's no coincidence that Minsk twice served as a universal platform for negotiations and the signing of the well-known agreements. But as they say, nothing lasts forever under the moon. In the past 8 years, Alexander Lukashenko's foreign policy has shifted towards stronger pro-Russian alignment. He always insisted he would only cross the Ukrainian border on a tractor. However, on that gloomy morning of February 24, 2022, it wasn't tractors that moved toward Kyiv from Belarus, but real tanks and armored vehicles marked with the letters V and Z. Before, there was at least some hope that if things got really serious, Lukashenko would back out and not support the plans of the Kremlin dwarf, to at least preserve the remnants of his subjectivity and demonstrate the independence of his foreign policy. However, now all illusions have finally disappeared. Batka will support Putin even against the national interests of his own state. For him, the most important thing is to hold on to power for at least another 10-15 years, so that his beloved son Kolenka can finally grow up and take his father's throne. In Minsk, the deployment of nuclear weapons just a few dozen kilometers from the border creates a situation where the Suwalki corridor can be completely seized from both sides. from Kaliningrad as well as from Belarus. In addition, both in Kaliningrad and in Belarus, there are well-known Iskander missile systems deployed, as well as retrained Belarusian pilots for the use of aerial nuclear weapons, such as Su-25 aircraft. It should also be remembered that, in addition to tactical weapons, the entire region, including the Suwalki corridor, is within full range of Russian strategic nuclear weapons, whose carriers are intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched missiles, and strategic aviation such as the Tu-95 and Tu-160. Such weapons can be launched from deep within Russian territory itself. And this already poses not a local, but a truly global threat to Suwalki, and not just for them. Hybrid threats and infrastructure attacks. The fact that the threat of creating gray zones in the Baltic countries is now being taken more seriously does not mean that the Kremlin has abandoned the format of hybrid aggression. Not at all. It just has a different character and is already happening now. Yes, you heard right. Right before our eyes, Russia is probing NATO to understand how serious these so-called red lines really are. The Suwalki corridor also plays a significant role in this regard. The most striking and recent example of a hybrid attack is the high-profile incident involving 24 drones entering Polish territory, which occurred on September 10, 2025. They came directly from Belarus. Many, of course, will say that nothing serious happened because the drones were not carrying any payload and, therefore, did not pose any real danger to the Polish population. But even such empty drones demonstrate the seriousness of the intentions of the Russian leadership, because one of the most important components of hybrid warfare is chaos and panic. The later, allegedly accidental entry of 3 MiGs into Estonia 10 days after follows the same playbook. If the Kremlin continues to act in the same way, expect a rise in anxiety and uncertainty about the future among ordinary citizens. This will cause investment outflows and economic instability in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Poland's eastern voivodeships. Even without a direct military invasion, Putin can accomplish much through hybrid aggression. Western countries are cautiously monitoring the rise in enemy military activity. The drone flights occurred just 2 days before the joint Russian-Belarusian Zapad 2025 exercises, and coincidentally right near the Suwalki corridor. Although most activities were in the Grodno and Brest regions bordering Suwalki, things were also tense near Kaliningrad. At the same time as Zapad 2025, Russia's Baltic Fleet held exercises in Kaliningrad. Scheduled exercises. They were focused on naval operations, air defense, protection of maritime communications, and coordination of ship group actions. And despite the fact that these exercises were not formally advertised as part of the general drills, their synchronization in time creates a unified strategy. In fact, this demonstrated Russia's ability to operate simultaneously in 2 important directions, the western one through Belarus and the northwestern one from Kaliningrad. So, it can definitely be said that the 2 dictators were not practicing troop cooperation to repel attacks from some mythical terrorists, but rather putting their aggressive plans into practice. Plans to attack Suwalki from both sides. NATO's special focus on these exercises is entirely justified. Just remember how exactly Russia's full-scale attack on Ukraine began, and above all, the famous dash to Kyiv. It started precisely from joint exercises on the territory of Belarus called Allied Resolve 2022, right near the border with Ukraine. After the exercises ended, Russia didn't withdraw its troops, then on the morning of February 24th. But you already know all of this yourself. Of course, Putin's hybrid aggression may not be limited to just drone flights, aircraft, and constant military exercises. He has a wide range of proven tools and methods used globally. Consider the Baltic countries' energy vulnerability. Even without attacking the Suwalki Gap directly, saboteurs could easily destroy the gas pipeline I mentioned. And does the experience with sabotage on the Nord Streams demonstrate such a possibility? And if the power lines are blown up, then 3 countries could easily plunge into a blackout. After all, unlike Ukraine, which has plenty of electricity generation capacity, the situation is completely different for the Baltic states. After the Ignalina nuclear power plant, identical to Chernobyl, closed, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia are completely energy deficient. They rely solely on Poland for electricity, and Russia knows this vulnerability. And the final touch: drones. The experience of the current Russian-Ukrainian war shows that drones can achieve what artillery, mortars, tanks, and aircraft combined cannot. That means Russia can achieve the isolation of the Baltic countries it hates without a direct ground invasion, when not a single Russian or Belarusian soldier even crosses the border. Simply by turning, with the help of these flying machines, the Baltic corridor into a continuous kill zone, a zone of death and total destruction, a zone where not even a rabbit could slip through. Alas, these are the realities of today's war of drones and artificial intelligence. Is World War I really possible? First, I want to reassure you a little. Although the Suwalki corridor is potentially one of the most explosive places in the world, it's definitely not the only one. For example, the Taiwan Strait is no less dangerous for all of humanity. We've already discussed the reasons for this in previous videos. Or the Korean Peninsula, Daepyeoldorak Kim III, could easily try to turn Seoul and other South Korean cities into radioactive ash. Or the Middle East, which is already blazing and doesn't seem likely to calm down anytime soon. And again, we shouldn't forget that at the moment, the most likely place for the start of World War I is Ukraine. Right here. The stakes are at their highest here, and the level of escalation is extremely high. But let's get back to Suwalki. The fact that this region is literally explosive doesn't mean it's definitely going to blow up. A lot depends on specific circumstances. At the moment, that circumstance is the war in Ukraine. While it's ongoing, Putin probably can't focus much on the Baltics. So, all these hybrid tricks should most likely be seen as a test of strength, a probing action. Besides, there are other regions that are just as important, if not much more important to Moscow than the hated Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The situation in the Caucasus, where Russia is losing control more and more clearly every year, could pose a much greater danger to the Kremlin. Therefore, no matter how strong Putin and his cronies may think they are, they simply don't have enough resources for a war on 2 or even 3 fronts. Therefore, with Russia weakened by the war in Ukraine and having lost much of its forces and equipment, it is unlikely to attack NATO soon. So, 5 for sure. Naturally, in the current situation, NATO members should act decisively and quickly, strengthen defenses, and prepare for various aggressive policy scenarios. And a lot has already been done. NATO member states have deployed so-called forward presence battle groups in the Baltic countries and Poland. These groups, consisting of servicemen from various alliance nations, clearly signal collective defense. Their presence ensures that any aggressor would face not only Baltic and Polish armies, but also forces from the United States, Germany, the United Kingdom, and Canada. NATO has greatly expanded its rapid response forces and, as planned, can now deploy up to 300,000 personnel quickly during a crisis. In the Suwalki Gap area, moreover, NATO military exercises are held annually in this region. Their scenario always includes practicing rapid deployment of troops and equipment to defend the Suwalki corridor from a hypothetical invasion. This not only increases combat readiness, but also sends a clear signal to a potential adversary about the North Atlantic Alliance's readiness for joint action. A component of these exercises is dedicated to improving logistics, including the modernization of transport infrastructure, such as railways, highways, and bridges, to ensure the rapid and uninterrupted transfer of troops and equipment from Western Europe to the Baltic countries. NATO's strategy to deter a possible attack by Putin's Russia combines military presence, infrastructure development, regular exercises, and political deterrence. Thus, the Suwalki corridor is not some kind of abnormal zone, but a potential catalyst for a global conflict between Russia and NATO countries. And although a direct attack by Russia is unlikely in the near future due to its involvement in Ukraine, ignoring the growing risks could indeed lead to disaster. In that case, World War I is possible if the escalation gets out of control. For now, NATO countries have every opportunity to effectively prevent this scenario. The Suwalki corridor's future relies on the actual power balance and political will of all parties. and also on the extent to which the Kremlin dictator is willing to sacrifice all of humanity to fulfill his own ambitions and suppress his overgrown adolescent complexes. That's all from me. Thank you to all the channel sponsors for your financial support and to all the viewers who watched this video until the end. Goodbye everyone.